Hi, good afternoon. My name is John Bernhardt. I serve as the Associate Vice President for APPA, Leadership in Educational Facilities. We want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for APPA's Town Hall meeting on NFPA 3000, the standard for preparedness and response to active shooter and or hostile events. Today's panelists include several people that are joining us today. First is John Montes from NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, where John serves as the Emergency Services Specialist. He is currently assigned as Staff Liaison to the Technical Committees for Fire Service Training, EMS, Fire Service Occupational Safety and Health, and the Active Shooter Response Standard Programs, where he serves as Staff Liaison to the NFPA 3000 Technical Committee. In his role at the NFPA, John is assigned as representative to the Joint National EMS Leadership Forum, National EMS Advisory Council, Road to Zero Coalition, and the Firefighter Occupational Cancer Alliance, among others. And he's based in Quincy, Massachusetts at NFPA headquarters. Also with us today is Bill Koffel. He is the president of Koffel Associates, a fire protection and life safety engineering design and consulting firm. He's recognized as an expert in the fire protection and life safety aspects of codes and standards, and worked closely with APPA and its Standards and Codes Council. He is active in the development process of the industry's governing codes, standards, and design guidelines, including International Code Council, NFPA standards, the Society of Fire Protection Engineers, and Underwriters Laboratories. And finally, also with us is Rich Davis. He is a professional engineer and has served as a facilities engineer for the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. He received his Juris Doctorate from Seattle University and his engineering degree from Oregon State. He serves on the APPA Standards and Codes Council, which is responsible for overseeing APPA standards development activities as an accredited standards developer. And additionally, he serves as chair of the APPA NFPA Standards Work Group, which reviews changes to NFPA standards and the impact to educational facilities, drafting and preparing proposed changes and comments on behalf of APPA in our industry and our institutions. And while I'm speaking, I think we may be having some challenges moving to the slides, and I might need some assistance. Is Billy Zidek there?
John, I'm here. I'm moving the slides.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. My apologies. Okay, my screen may be frozen, but we'll keep on going here. The objectives for today is for this town hall meeting, we've designed it to accomplish a number of objectives here. First, we want to explain the purpose of NFPA 3000, as well as provide an overview of this recently drafted NFPA standard. We also want to identify sections of the draft that may impact educational facilities and solicit your feedback on NFPA 3000, which will allow APPA to prepare proposed changes and comments to NFPA and its technical committee. And those comments are going to be due to NFPA on February 23rd. We'll also be sharing some information about how APPA member institutions can also be engaged in that process of proposing changes and comments to this standard and others through NFPA. At this time, before we get further into the start and introduce speakers, we also want to provide you with a poll as part of our town hall meeting. We're going to ask you to answer a question, and the question should be on your screen right now, which is, which one of the following best describes your job responsibilities? And you'll see we've identified several categories. We're asking you to complete one of the above. This will give our speakers a better handle as to who we have in the audience today. And if you could take a moment to complete the poll, and we'll give you just a few seconds to do this. And Billy, I may rely on you to share with us what the poll results are. If you don't mind, I'm looking for them on the screen, but I'm not sure I'm finding them.
We're up to 83% of our attendees have voted so far.
Thank you, everyone. And then could you share with us the results of the poll?
Okay, I just closed the poll. 45% facility physical plant management, 3% residential life student affairs, 37% first responder, police, fire, campus safety, EMS, environmental health and safety personnel, 1% healthcare hospital personnel, and 14% said none of the above.
Okay, well, thank you very much for everyone for participating, and that gives us a better handle as to who our audience is today. At this time, we're going to have some brief comments from Rich Davis on the APPA Standards and Codes Council, so I'll turn it over to Rich at this time.
Thank you, John. The APPA Standards and Codes Council was established in 2012 and has been in operation with substantially with the folks that you see on your screen. We are, before that, we were the Codes and Advocacy Task Force, and that's a temporary organization under the APPA framework. So the board at that time decided that we were doing a fairly good job and changed us into a council, which is something that allows us to participate on a longer term basis, on a permanent basis, sort of. And so that's how it works. Most of the people you see here have been with the organization the entire time. And if I could have the next slide, please, Billy. That would be helpful. And this webinar is basically an important element in our mission, and that is to seek your input into codes and find out where we can advocate for you. So that's an important part of our work, and we spend a lot of time figuring out how to get that input. And this webinar town hall meeting is basically that. And next slide. And I think I'll turn it back over to John at this point.
Thanks, Rich. The other slide you have in front of you, it just talks a little bit about APPA as an ANSI accredited standards developer. We are a developer of American National Standards as of 2.5 years ago. APPA recently published its first American National Standard called APPA 1000, Total Cost of Ownership for Facilities Asset Management. It's available on APPA's bookstore. Part 1 is the published standard key principles on total cost of ownership. And Part 2, implementation. The implementation standard is in development at this time and will be published the first quarter of next year. At least that's the tentative date for that standard to be published. Also, we have a third standards project, APPA 1100, which is a facilities terms and definitions standard that will be published as an online database in this spring of this year. So we can move to the next slide. So at this time, I'm going to turn things over to John Montes at NFPA.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The first thing I want to talk about is just what brought us to NFPA 3000, what got us here as a country. Looking back, the FBI on their webpage keeps a record of statistics that are available for view by the public about active shooter hostile events and where they occur, and so location, their impact, their frequency, things of that nature. What you're seeing in front of you is from 2000 to 2013. So there's interesting that they even break it down further, but commerce, businesses is the #1 location, education second, government locations is third, open space, residences, healthcare, and houses of worship rounded out. What's really interesting about these numbers is that in all of that, from 2000 to 2013, 1,042 people were either killed or injured in an active shooter hostile event. Since 2013 through 2017, which is a much shorter time frame, that number has doubled. So that speaks to the increase in frequency and the increase in severity of the events. Can we go to the next slide? So what happened was the NFPA was approached in October of 2016, and we were asked in a proposal request to develop a standard for preparedness and response to active shooter hostile events. The proposer was Otto Drost from Orange County, Florida, and he proposed it as an after-action item after the Pulse nightclub incident. His department was one of the departments that responded that night. The NFPA published the proposal for 3 months until January of 2017. And along with publishing the proposal, we also asked for public comment about whether or not we should continue with the project, and if people were interested in participating in the technical committee. We received over 100 public comments, several from large organizations, and 97% of the comment was in support of us developing the standard. We also received 103 applications for the technical committee. In April of 2017, our Standards Council formed the technical committee that's developing NFPA 3000, and that committee has been working on it since. The committee is 46 members, and I'll get into that in 1 second. The committee did set some main objectives for 3000. There's 4 of them. The 3 that you see here, unified command, and really unified command is valuable. The concept there is police, fire, EMS, and what's new and different is somebody responsible for the facility, both financially and with the knowledge of the facility, should be part of unified command. Integrated response, those are those integrated teams between police, fire, and EMS that allow responders to access patients faster. The best example as to why that's important is the Columbine incident. 9 of the victims that passed away died of exsanguination that was preventable if they had been accessed by responders within the first 20 minutes. So those people waited so long because there was no integration between fire, EMS, and police that the fire and EMS were staged outside waiting to go in until the building was secure completely and not into the warmer areas that had been cleared but not completely secured. So integrated response is the next concept. You may have heard of that as like rescue task force, protected island, protected corridor. Those are some of the concepts there. And then recovery starts today. The committee feels strongly that you have to plan for recovery right now, not when the recovery phase occurs. And you have to have those resources in place because when you're in the fog of managing the incident, it's too hard to know what you're supposed to do. Next slide, please. So last thing I'll speak to before I talk about who will be impacted is that the committee for NFPA 3000 is made up of 46 principal members. It is a balanced committee by user group, which is, enforcers, special experts, users, labor, but it's also balanced by capability. In other words, it's balanced between police, fire, and EMS. There's heavy law enforcement presence on this committee, both federal, national, and users with experience from real events. As an example, there's a police officer that was at the San Bernardino incident. There's a police officer that was shot at Oak Creek. All of those are members of the committee. It's also balanced because it has universities. There's a representative from Auburn University and a representative from UConn. It has emergency management, IAEM, International Association of Emergency Managers, is represented. As a matter of fact, the chair of the committee is Richard Serino. He was Deputy Administrator of FEMA and on the National Security Council under the last administration. So to give you an idea, it's a very balanced committee and it's new and different. It's actually our largest committee outside of the NEC. Who will be impacted? It's for everybody. That's that whole community concept. The thing the committee really stresses is that you can't manage these incidents in a vacuum. You have to partner with others and work together. And that even includes the public with knowing their instructions of run, hide, fight, and stop the bleed. Responders working unified and integrated with facilities. And then the recovery pieces and the healthcare pieces also being participants in that. 3000 is on a fast track to become a provisional standard. And the reason for that is what we've discussed previously. These events are occurring more frequently. They're occurring with a larger impact. And there's currently no standard guidance out there. The other thing that's important to highlight about why it's a provisional standard, about it being a provisional standard, I should say, is that there's this emergency nature, and the committee felt strongly that there needed to be something. And there's currently no standard out there. There's lots of great guidance, and all of that guidance was used in the creation of 3000. There's the Hartford Consensus, the DHS White Paper. There's all this great information out there, but nothing was a standard. Nothing set that minimum bar. And that's what 3000 is doing, is it's setting that minimum bar and getting communities to work together. The committee is going to be meeting at NFPA headquarters in March. And the standard, as a provisional standard, should be coming out in mid-April. As soon as it comes out, the NFPA will put it right back into cycle within 45 days. And it will go through the full NFPA process ending in 2020, 24 months. With that, we can go to the next slide. So here's who's developing the standard. It's a 46-member committee. I already spoke to most of this. There's representatives across all of those folks, and it should be ready soon. Next slide. And here's the scope and purpose of 3000. Again, setting that minimum bar, level of competence. So there's actually competencies in the chapter for law enforcement, fire, and EMS. Managing, sustaining these programs, and thinking of it as a program. And a program includes the plans, the guidelines, and the procedures. Recommending what those minimum elements are to reduce the effect of the event. And it applies to everybody, communities, authorities having jurisdiction, facilities, and members of organizations who respond to prepare for active shooter events. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, John. So everyone has received a good introduction to NFPA 3000, what has led to the development process, who will be impacted, who is developing the standard. This next item we have up here is a second poll we'd like you to participate in. And this one is where we're asking you, in an active shooter drill or live event, who on your campus would likely serve as the decision maker on behalf of the facility during the incident? We're going to ask you to just take a few seconds here to very quickly plug into this. And as in short, we will get underway after this in just a second with the review of the standard led by Bill Koffel. So Billy, if you can let us know where you're seeing maybe about an 80 or 85% rate of return on this, and then we'll very quickly close it out and provide everybody with the answers here.
We're at 60% now.
Okay, we'll give you just a few more seconds. And if we can close it now, and Billy, can you share with us what you're showing?
20% President Administration, 14% Senior Facility Officers and AVP, 49% Campus Emergency Management, 7% none of the above, 9% I don't know or uncertain.
Okay.
And
so
quick question, did everyone lose my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I did. Yes.
All right. Please bear with me while I restart it.
Okay. So looking at the poll results, clearly there are a lot of our members out there and those who've joined us today that have a good handle as to how they would approach a decision on having how they would go about having a decision maker at the actual incident, and also perhaps the drills themselves. That's a good question for us to ask you, because as Bill will share in a few minutes about the, I guess it's Chapter 8, Bill, of the draft, there is a reference to facility management and facility managers and the need for them to be part of that command for drills and also for an actual live event should one to occur. So this time we're going to turn things over to Bill Koffel and have him talk a little bit about the standard, give you an overview, and then do a bit of a dive into some of the chapters that are most critical to all of our audience today. Bill?
Well, thank you, John. And as John indicated, there are 20 chapters in this document. We're not going to talk about all of them. In fact, our intent really is not to go into significant detail on any of them. We're just going to highlight a few things that we think may be of interest to you, and show you how to navigate around the document and how to submit any public comments if you're interested in submitting any public comments. So let me just get this changed. Oh, oops, we lost it again.
Oops.
Hi, Bill, we apologize. I think we're having some difficulties here, but we're getting it back online in just a second.
Everything always works in our dry run, and then...
Yeah, I know. Such is life, right? It's always the live event.
Bill, you should have it.
Okay. Yeah, I just had to find out now why my mouse isn't working. Not sure what happened there. Just a second. Looks like my computer is the one that might have been causing you the problem, Billy. Maybe Billy, in the meantime, I know we wanted to do this from my computer, but maybe we might have to do it from your computer because I'm not picking up.
You're back now.
Well, it's my screen.
Yeah, that's hers. But something's hung up on my computer. I'm not getting my mouse to work to allow me to move around.
All right, well, I'm going to have to pause my screen and go out and get to the NFPA site.
So what we want to show you first, I'll continue to talk through this as Billy does this. You saw on a previous slide how to get to what NFPA refers to as a doc info page for any of their standards. The particular one in question is NFPA 3000. So if you go to nfpa.org/3000, you will get to a page specifically devoted to this document. And this is how you can monitor everything that's going on, the committee meetings, the agenda for the meetings, what actions the committee has taken, once they're balloted. There can be resource documents, reference material put on this doc info page. So it's a valuable resource for any of us that are trying to monitor what is happening with NFPA 3000. And in a moment, Billy will get there. But while she's working on that, let me just talk to the slide that we have. And what we've done on this slide is we've identified some of the chapters that we think may be of interest, and I'll go through these as I walk through the document. You have them in the handout. Some of them may not be directly of interest to you. Some may be of an interest to somebody else on your campus or at your facility, and you may want to just share this document with them. So here we are. Now we're signed in as Billy. You can get to this page whether you are an NFPA member or not. And there may be, even if you're not a member, they'll ask you to sign in as a guest. And there's some good reasons to do that in terms, in particular, if you are submitting public comments. But here we are on I'll call it the home page for NFPA 3000. You can see various tabs down at the bottom, basically highlighting the types of things that I said you can find on this doc info page about NFPA 3000. But what we're really going to do is kind of walk through the document. So Billy, if you would go to where it says submit public input. Now this is actually going to take us, shall I say, out of the doc info page into a different software package that NFPA has, which is called TerraView. This is how they manage their code and standards development process. Staff works with this. Those of us that submit public input, public comments, we work in this as well. So now we're in TerraView, and what you will see as we go through this, you'll be able to see portions of the document. But before we do that, let me just highlight something, and we don't need to go there, Billy, but if in the left side you see the second bullet down, actually above that, under where it says NFPA doc info pages, the next one says my public input comments. As you generate public input or comments, you can go to this, you can click on that icon, and you can see any of the public comments that you've prepared, whether they've been submitted or not. You'll get a list of your specific public comments. Also, please understand that nobody sees any public comment until the closing date. So there's no harm in working in this system, developing drafts, preparing them, even submitting them. You'll get an email that says you've submitted a public comment, but it is not available to the public until the closing date. Okay? And then it will be shared with the committee and it will be available to the public. So again, using the previous slide, we're going to go to a couple chapters. So Billy, if you would click on chapter 1. So in an NFPA document, go ahead and click on that we can actually see, so where it says chapter 1 administration, just click on that. So what I've done is I've just opened up chapter 1. Now, if I wanted to go to a particular sections in chapter 1, I could have clicked on 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. I chose not to do that. But chapter 1 will contain no technical document. In your review of this document, what you will see in chapter 1 is a scope statement, a purpose statement, and the application of the document. So questions like, does this apply to new or existing facilities? That's going to be in 1.3, and what this document is all about. And John already talked to us about the scope. You see in 1.1 the scope statement, and that's essentially what was on the slide that he used. So that's all I'll say about chapter 1 right now. We want to have some time for discussion, so I'm going to move on. Chapter 2 is merely a list of reference publications. We didn't have that on the slide. We don't need to go there. Chapter 3, I don't know that you need to go there unless, as you're reading through the document, you come across a term and you say, I wonder what the committee means by that term. Then you can go back to chapter 3 and see how the committee has defined that term. But unless we're working or you're proposing a revised definition to a term as it's used in the document, there's really no reason for us to go to chapter 3. So the next chapter that we highlighted on the slide was chapter 4. Billy, if we could just pull up all of chapter 4. Okay. So chapter 4 talks about a risk assessment. And what I want to point out is this is different than the risk assessment that you might already be familiar with, which was a risk assessment that was done to determine if you need a mass notification system. And that is covered under NFPA 72. This talks about a risk assessment to identify the threats within the organization. And notice in 4111, it says it applies to those organizations, which could be a campus, and jurisdictions responsible for organizing an active shooter hostile event response program. It actually does say in here that there's a responsibility of the authority having jurisdiction to determine the threats within that jurisdiction. Now, again, if I were to do this on a campus itself, I would be that entity. Notice that 4.2 talks about identifying threats within an organization or jurisdiction. So again, as you review this document, think about this as an activity different than the risk assessment that you have for mass notification. This is really trying to identify those threats. Let's go to chapter, let's see, we're going to skip chapter 5, 6, and 7. That's not to say there's not good information in there, but again, we want to highlight some that may be of interest to you. And let's go to chapter 8. So right before we started this discussion, John put up the poll question and he said, you know, who at your facility is the responsible party during the incident? And there was a reason he asked that question. So Billy, she's already scrolling down. If you scroll down a little bit further, you'll see under this unified command, it talks about who the unified command is, and it consists of, there we have it, 842. It consists of the fire service, the emergency medical service, law enforcement agency, And there's number 4, the decision makers from a facility if impacted. Now, what's really intended here is an individual that's going to be familiar with your facility, that they're a resource to this unified command team, that they have familiarity with the facility, they can share information with the law enforcement personnel or the other first responders. If the desire is to secure certain areas, this person's going to have familiarity as to, is that a possibility? How would we do that? Can it be done? How would we get that implemented? So they are part of this unified command during the incident. And that was the purpose of that question. So again, as you go down through Chapter 8, not only look at some of the specific requirements, but give thought to your own plans and who this entity should be that's going to have this interface with the unified command during the incident. Also realize that during the incident, that person might actually change. So I have a background in the fire service. There were clearly times when I was the officer in charge of the fire scene if I was riding the officer seat in the first piece of apparatus that arrived on the scene. But as a battalion chief arrives or a chief officer above me arrives, they may now assume that responsibility. So the same thing can happen at your facility during the incident. There may be a particular individual that's initially going to be in charge, an entity. It may not be a single individual, but an entity that is there 24 hours a day, and we can say that is the person who's in charge until somebody else arrives, whether that's a assistant vice president in charge of facilities or whoever it is under your particular plan. So let's go then to Chapter 9. And on this one, I think, Billy, if you expand Chapter 9 or scroll down, this talks about emergency plans and things that you can do. But I want to scroll down to the bottom. Again, we're not here to try to direct or give you any guidance. We're here to give you information. And we're looking for you to provide feedback to us, as John said, so that APPA can submit public comments representing you as your organization. But I will say that 9.5 is one of those sections that the task group within the Standards and Code Council that has been looking at this, they've raised some concern with this. So I just want to highlight it for you. I'm not trying to offer any particular opinion, but note that it says that in addition to anything that you might be required to do in terms of a fire drill in any of your buildings on campus, you're required to have an annual exercise of your active shooter hostile event procedures, and that it should involve different portions of the structure each year. The concern I'm hearing is the number of structures or buildings that are on a campus. And, is there an alternative to this? Now, there is an annex note in Chapter 19 that talks about different ways of doing this exercise in terms of tabletop or, physical activities, that type of thing. That annex note isn't here. I will say I personally have already submitted a comment to put that annex note here. But again, I'm not here to try to guide you in any particular way. But this is something that I think the committee needs to hear. Is this practical? And when you provide the committee with input like that, it's best if you give them an alternative, a suggestion. So if you think this is unreasonable, is there a number of exercises that can be done? Are there a way to describe certain building types on campus that should be included in this? Again, you're providing input to the committee. You've got a group of experts there that are going to review your input, and they're going to make a decision based upon that. Okay, just so we can keep moving, I don't think I'm actually going to open up Chapters 10. Let me just stay here where we are, Billy. So Chapter 10 talks about financial management. If I were to do a quick summary of that chapter, it basically says the costs associated with this program needs to be clearly identified. Obviously, this standard can't mandate anybody to allocate specific amount of funds, but it does say that we have to identify what the financial costs are. Chapter 11 talks about a communication center. In many of these incidents, your community, your first responders are going to potentially bring in some type of mobile command post that will be where this unified command will be located. But again, Chapter 11 talks about that communication center. Now, Chapter 12, from our poll, we don't seem to have law enforcement people on this call, but this is something you may want to share with your law enforcement group on campus. Most, at least larger universities, have their own law enforcement teams. Smaller ones, maybe they have security response personnel. Again, just share with this that this is being proposed as a standard. And as John said, it talks about competencies, what these individuals should be able to do. The same thing with Chapter 13. With your fire or EMS. Now, fewer campuses that I'm familiar with actually have a fire department or an emergency medical service. But if you do, you want to make sure that they're aware of the competencies that are identified herein. And then anybody who is responding would have an interest in Chapter 14 and Chapter 15. Chapter 14 talks about the protective equipment that the responders are to have, and that equipment, it depends upon where you are. So you'll see in the document references to things like the hot zone. So they've divided the area around the incident into 3 different zones. And if I'm in the hot zone, there's a certain level of protective equipment I need to have. If I'm not in the hot zone, if I'm in a warm area, then there's another level of equipment that I would have to have. And 15 talks about the training that we would be required to do. Chapter 16 goes into public education. Now, when I first picked up this document, I said, okay, well, that's the community, and that's what the community has a responsibility to educate the citizens within the community. But I think we need to look at it differently. Again, you have a population on your campus. The students, the staff, and the faculty that are on your campus. That's your community. And I would think that you're probably going to assume some public education role in terms of this program that is being implemented. So again, take a look at Chapter 16 from the perspective of what the document says about public education. Public information, that's more, during the incident, what is being said, who is saying it. Again, take a look at Chapter 17 from that perspective. And Chapter 18, continuity of operations. So there are some facilities, like if you have a hospital on campus, that hospital needs to continue to operate during this incident. We just can't evacuate the hospital and shut everything down. I might be able to do that in a classroom building. I might be able to do that in a dorm, but a residence hall, but there are other buildings on campus that are going to have to continue to operate. So look at that, and Chapter 18 talk about continuity of operation. Chapter 19, unless you have a healthcare facility, a hospital on your campus, probably isn't relevant to your facility or your campus, but this talks about what a hospital needs to do in terms of preparedness and response for an incident outside of the hospital. So if you have a hospital on campus, several of the other chapters that I've talked about are going to apply because that's the structure where the incident is. But this is now saying we have a hospital on campus. There is an incident, maybe on the campus, maybe not on the campus, but people are going to be transported to our university hospital. What do we need to prepare for? In Chapter 19, we'll talk about that. And then Chapter 20 talks about recovery. And, there's talk there in Chapter 20 about responsible parties as well. That could be most likely will be a completely different entity from that responsible party that we talked about under the unified command structure during the incident. So that kind of walks us through the document. I just want to mention Annex A. as you go through the document, for example, if we look on what's on your screen right now, 941, you see an asterisk after that. That tells me there's something in Annex A. It's supplemental information. If you read 941 and you have a concern or a question, you should go look at that annex note. If you're proposing a change to 941, you should probably go look at the annex note to see if the change you're recommending should also be made into that annex note. So in the couple minutes that I have left, what I'd like to do, Billy, if you would simply click on the 9.5 box. Okay, and go to add a new section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how, actually, close out of that for a moment. Let me do it easier than this. Okay, let's go to 952. Click on 952. And we're going to revise the existing section. So let's say that we don't think that this exercise should be annual. We think it should be every 5 years. And I'm just making this up. I'm not proposing this. So Billy, if you would go to annual and just highlight annual and hit your delete button. And go after the word shall. And then just type in these exercises shall and type in be conducted every 5 years and okay, and then hit next. So what I just did is I just proposed a change to 952. They made it very easy for me to put that into the system, and then it shows up in what's referred to as legislative text. So when the committee now looks at this, they know exactly what you're proposing as a change. Now I go to next. So you'll hit next again. We don't, in this case, let's say we don't have any other proposed changes related to this. So now I have to type in a statement, and Billy, just type something in like every year is too often. All right. Hopefully you have some better rationale than that, but for purposes of our discussion here this afternoon. All right, so now we're going to hit next. All right, in the public comment phase for most documents, I need to tie a comment to a public input. Since this is following that provisionary standard process, we don't have the two phases. We just went right to public comment. So there are no public inputs, so you can just hit next. Now, notice this is the advantage of signing in. It already says that who I am, in this case, Billy, since it's on her computer, her email address or her ID, and then who she's representing. All right, so everything's fine there. Hit next. And then this box is a tick box under the signature that aren't signature words. So go ahead and tick that, Billy. And this merely says, you haven't stolen this language from somewhere. You're not violating any copyright. What we just typed in there are our thoughts, and we can submit these to NFPA, and they would have the ability to print this. The other thing we're basically saying is we're giving them copyright privileges on this information, or on this verbiage. So you can't come back and sue them for copyright infringement at some other point in time. Now you notice we have a couple of options. So we could go back and change anything. What I'm going to have Billy do is I'm going to actually have her submit it. So go ahead and click submit. Now remember, nobody can see this yet. And now I get this little box that says public input number 557 that I just created and we just submitted. Now in Billy's computer, she just got 2 emails from NFPA. One said you created public input 577 and the other said you submitted public input 577. If you did not submit it and you only saved it, you get the one email saying, we created this. A nice feature in the NFPA system is if you create something but you don't submit it, they will send you a reminder, I don't know, it's a day or two before the deadline to say you created something, you didn't submit it yet, do you want it to submit? Now, I went ahead and had her submit this. Notice that if she goes into that box, she can view it, but if you go over to edit, she can edit it. So you've rethought this whole thing. You don't think 5 years is right. You think it's 2 years. We're not going to go through this, but she could go in there and she could now cross off the 2 or I'm sorry, delete the 5 and put 2 in there and then go through this whole process and resubmit it. It'll make that change. But let's just close this. Now, the other thing is we just did this for educational purposes. We don't really intend this. So, Billy, go ahead and click delete so it's no longer in the system. Yes, you want to delete it. Okay. So, John, as a staff person, the committee is never going to see what we just did. But it is that simple. Now, I'm going to turn it back to John because he's going to talk about the process. And again, hopefully we'll have some time to discuss any of the issues you have, and John or I, or I guess we have 2 Johns, Rich or I, will try to answer any questions you have. So, John, if you want to tell them how to proceed from here.
Yeah, and Bill, thank you. We did have a number of questions coming through the chat box, and with about 15 minutes left in the session, I thought we could dedicate the next 10 minutes to a couple of questions we saw come in. Thank you for those of you who have submitted questions. Some of you have asked about how does a member of the public get a PDF or single document to review the standard in whole. My understanding, and John Montes is still on the line here, obviously he could probably tell us, but I believe only an electronic version is available, the one that we just viewed on the site. Is that right, John?
That's correct. So because this is in a draft form, it's not available as a published document. So it's only available through the online system because you have to understand this is some pretty new and different information, and we don't want copies out there in the world with people thinking, oh, this is the standard now. It's very much a draft, and if we were to publish a PDF or downloadable, people could take it and run with it as it's chapter and verse, and it won't be available in those formats until it's complete.
Okay, thank you. So it's very important for everyone to know that the way you were just shown and by Bill and also Billy Zidek on our staff is the way you view the standard and also provide comments on the standard, but that is the way you can, that is really the only way you can view it, what is online. And then there will be instructions that we will be sending out to everyone to follow up on what Bill's comments were here, along with some additional information, including the PowerPoint slide. And I believe we're also archiving this event as well, which we'll make that available as a link, which we'll share with everyone once everything's posted. There's another question. I think this was coming up, Bill, when you talked a little bit about Chapter 9 and the requirements for annual exercises. It says, I wonder if APPA's recommendation might be to annually exercise types or classifications of buildings. For instance, a classroom, mass assembly, a residence hall, much easier and more likely to be fulfilled on a campus rather than 100+ buildings. That was Mike Mayers. Thank you for your comment. And so let me throw that out to Bill and maybe to John as well to respond on that.
So yes, Mike, thank you for your comment. Really, the purpose of this webinar is to, in 1 hour, bring you up to speed with where NFPA 3000 is. We are looking, APPA is looking for your input. So whatever public input APPA submits, it's going to be based upon what we hear from the APPA membership. Now, again, you as an individual facility can go in and submit your own public input. And again, John will talk about that before we close the session. But we're looking for suggestions for you. I just threw a couple things out. Again, not trying to lead the discussion in any particular direction. But you're right. Maybe we say that you should have an annual exercise in at least one classroom building and at least one residence hall and at least one large assembly. That's a way it could be written. It is fair game right now. We can submit anything we want within the context of this draft that we have. Just say how we think the document should read. The committee will review that. They will accept it or not. Basically, and John can share this with you better than I can, there are going to be 3 options. they're either going to put it in, they're not going to put it in, they'll tell you why, if they don't put it in, or they're going to hold it till the next revision cycle. John, do you want to add any comments?
Yeah, so because it's a provisional standard, normally in an NFPA cycle, there's really two opportunities to make your voice heard. But because it's a provisional standard within the rules of ANSI, we don't have to do that. But in order to fully inform the committee and expedite the process at the same time, that's why we're accepting public comments. So the committee will review everything that gets put in, and a report will be published after the committee meets in March that says what they decide to do with it, whether they choose to accept it, flat out reject it, and why, or whether they think it's valuable information, but they're not sure what they want to do with it yet, so they're going to hold it for that full revision cycle that starts immediately after release. So this is the opportunity to tell them what you think and what you want in this document. I know that the task group and the committee that really focused on the development of this chapter wants to hear from the community and learn what the community's wants are in this. And this is a great opportunity. You know, it's unique. You're going to get an answer.
John, thank you. You know, there's another question here I want to bring up too. There's someone is asking by structure, quote unquote, do you mean the organization or the actual building? And I'm losing track of which chapter, whether it's, I want to say it's either 8 or 9 where they use the term structure. Maybe I'm wrong there, but I think they mean the building itself, if that's my recollection from reading it. Is that correct? Or do you know?
Yeah, I believe any reference to structure is the building itself. Organization is whoever's creating the program under which envelops it. Could be a community, it could be a campus. You set the parameters of your program, and that's what they mean by organization.
Okay, very good. And I think there's some of that is interchangeable. I think I noticed that too when we were reviewing the draft last week leading up to this, was that in some places you'll see the term facility, structure, it will jump from one to the other, but I think it's all about the built environment or the building, I guess, is really what we're referring in both instances for the most part. There's a question about the standard, and it's the distinctions between what NFPA is trying to create and perhaps standards and guidance that are already issued by FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security. And John, this was something I know we noticed and we've talked about here for the last few days, is that if you look at some of the documents that are referred and are not necessarily listed in the annex or in Chapter 2, I think, is where there's also other reference documents. But there is reference in some of the chapters to various documents. I think a national, I guess it's a Department of Homeland Security document that's been established, and there's a reference to the document in the actual body of the standard. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that too. You and I had some conversation on this before the webinar a few days ago, but maybe you could elaborate on why those references are there and whether they can actually hold water since they're built into the standard itself as part of the code.
Sure. So I believe they're in Chapter 5. There's a couple of references to the National Preparedness Program and the National, I forget the name of the other one, but I know where they are. They're in Chapter 5. There's 2 DHS documents that are referenced there, and they said that basically Chapter 5 is your program and your plan outline structure, and they say that the plan development process has to be in line with FEMA's planning development process guidelines. And they say that the program for the active shooter response needs to be in line with DHS's white paper on active shooter programs. So it's really important to note that FEMA and DHS are at the table and they are represented strongly on this committee, both as principal members, but also their staff come to the meetings to help with drafting the language and be part of the task groups. So they're doing this with us. They believe strongly in this standard, and they can provide guidance, but the standard at least sets those minimum bars and appropriately references their guidance. Okay. So it does need to be added, though, to Chapter 2 and to Annex B, and that's actually a note for when the committee meets that they need to make those additions.
Okay, and maybe another question to ask as we're thinking it through is those guidance documents, they're probably more susceptible to revision and change. So, I don't know if down the road there might be thought to referencing those documents and maybe a particular version of those documents if you're putting it into an NFPA standard. It seems like you want to make sure that people know that precisely which guideline or document is being referred to. Would there be an attempt by the technical committee maybe to look at that at some point, or now or in the future?
Certainly, and I know that they've had that discussion. I will say though, with the planning and the preparedness doctrine from FEMA, the preparedness resources guideline, it doesn't have like an annual cycle, but it does get updated. So that's why the committee went high level and just referenced the page and put a link to the web page in Annex A, because they know that gets updated. I think that the way the language is written now, it's designed to be flexible enough that your program can just adjust as you find out adjustments there. But there should be some sort of mechanism for identifying when those things are updated and sharing that through the standard. It may be similar to how we do with other standards, and Bill probably knows this really well, where every time the standard goes through its revision cycle, the reference publications are updated. But I'm not sure yet, but that's a great feedback that I'll take to the committee.
Okay, very good. Thank you. We're at about the 5-minute mark here before we close out. So I think what we're going to do at this point is go back to the slides. Billy, if you don't mind taking us to the second to the last slide, I guess, before we close it out. So we're going to talk about next steps for APPA, and we alluded to this already throughout the call. But so everyone knows that our next step at APPA is to finalize its contributions and public comments. We appreciate everyone being here today and getting your feedback, and we would also encourage you to continue emailing us, Billy, B-I-L-L-I-E, at appa.org, and also myself, John, J-O-H-N, at appa.org. If you have additional comments or thoughts about what you heard today and would like to submit some suggestions on how APPA might go with proposing changes and comments, those comments and contributions that APPA puts together over the next few days are going to be posted on the APPA website on Tuesday, February 20th, after the APPA Standards and Codes Council reviews those proposed comments and proposed changes that we will be submitting. And when we do that, we will also notify all of you who've joined us in the registration, as well as all APPA members, to let you know that those are available for review. I think we also have plans to provide the PowerPoint and also an archived viewable copy of today's event as well, which you can share with others in your own organization or with peers at other institutions. We'll be doing that as well by that time. And as Bill Koppel shared, APPA members and stakeholders may want to separately submit comments and proposed changes following their own review of the draft standard. And the deadline for that public input is 5 p.m. Eastern Time, Eastern Standard, on February the 23rd. It's coming up right around the corner. And so that's how we're going to proceed at APPA and the APPA Standards Codes Council's efforts underway here. I want to thank, once again, Bill Koppel, Rich Davis. I want to thank John Montes, and also Billy Zidek, our Standards and Codes Administrator, for all the support she's given today. We apologize for some of the problems we had, technical problems, but hopefully everyone was able to appreciate what we did, and we have everything coming at you in an archive set as well. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a pleasant Valentine's Day. Goodbye.